Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Robust Opposition. With me is my special guest, Bruce Gagnon. How you doing, Bruce?
Good. Thank you for having me on.
Sure. Bruce is the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. And he was a co-founder of Global Network when it was created in 1992. Between 83 and 98, he was the state coordinator of the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice and has worked on space issues for over 40 years. In 1987, he organized the largest peace protest in Florida history when over 5,000 people marched on Cape Canaveral in opposition to the first flight test of the Trident II nuclear missile. I remember in college, I protested the Trident submarine in Groton, Connecticut. I went to Wesleyan, not too far away from there. And we were also protesting the Seabrook nuclear power plant. Lots in your bio here. I'm just going to say that 2006, you were the recipient of the Dr. Benjamin Spock Peacemaker Award. You initiated the Maine campaign to bring our war money home in 2009 that spread to other New England states and beyond. This campaign makes the important connection between endless war spending and fiscal crisis in the United States. In 2013, he helped organize the passage of a drone bill in the Maine state legislature that requires police to obtain warrants before they can spy on the public, and the bill was vetoed by the governor. You have so much in this bio that the last thing that I want to mention is in 1968, you were the vice chair of the Okaloosa County, and that's Florida, Young Republicans Club, while working on the Nixon campaign for president. So I guess we all have an evolution in our politics, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So we're here tonight to talk about this impending war with Ukraine, which we hope war with Russia over Ukraine, which we hope peace activists around the world are going to be able to stop. And we're here to just dispel some of the myths and propaganda that people are seeing on the mainstream corporate media in the United States about why they're trying to cast Russia as the enemy and Ukraine as the poor victim. And it finally got to the point where after Biden had a conversation with the Ukrainian President Zelensky last Friday, he had to come out and say, stop it. You're talking about this war that, is not this, you're beating the drums for war and talking about a condition that doesn't really exist. And today, Putin had his first remarks about it. And why do you think the United States, well, first of all, Bruce came to my attention when my friend, fellow peace activist Marcy Winograd forwarded me a little speech he made in Bath, Maine at a protest organized by Lisa Savage, who was the Green Party candidate I supported for Senate in Maine, by the way. And he was speaking about a couple of things that I didn't know about. A few years ago, I did a show about Ukraine and how we actually orchestrated a coup there in 2014, as much as we like to say it was the opposite. And Russia did all the instigating. It was actually us. Anyway, he was talking about some things that I didn't realize, which is the role of climate change in the United States' reason for, egging on this hostility, and also a report that the Rand Corporation authored. So maybe you can tell the viewers, Bruce, this angle that you have that we haven't seen elsewhere in the media, in the mainstream media, or even in the independent media.
All right. Well, thank you, Lauren. Well, it's been some years now that our senator, one of our senators in Maine, Angus King, he's so-called independent, he went on a joyride, U.S. submarine joyride that went under the Arctic Sea. And there was a New York Times columnist that was on that trip. And he wrote an article about it, which I read. And they interviewed the head of the Navy at that time. He was also on that joyride. And he talked about that it's really important that the United States owns, this was his word, owns the Arctic. We're going to own it. So that was kind of the first thing that triggered me to begin thinking more about the Arctic. And then I always loved to look at maps. So I went and looked at a map of the Arctic. And of course, Russia has the largest land border with the Arctic. And we know, of course, that because of climate crisis, the ice is melting in the Arctic. And then I found maps with descriptions of all the different resources in the Arctic, right along the Russian coast. And then I discovered this Rand Corporation study that calls for the unbalancing and overextending of Russia. And you put all those together along with one more thing. When I grew up in a military family. So when I was a kid, I was a right winger. I was a Republican. That's why I worked on Nixon's campaign when I was 16 years old. I didn't know any better. But I had a good heart, and I was inquisitive, and I believed in justice and freedom and democracy, all those things I was taught about going to school as a kid. And so I took a FBI correspondence course. I thought maybe I wanted to be an FBI agent because I wanted to fight against organized crime. I knew that I did. And one of the things I learned in that FBI correspondence course was every criminal has an MO, a modus operandi, a way of repeating their bad behavior. So as I started looking at all these pieces of this puzzle and putting them, so to speak, on the wall, it was clear to me that there was something at work here. And then I remembered how the United States, when Bill Clinton was president, broke apart Yugoslavia into smaller countries. And so that the US and NATO have a clear MO, a modus operandi, a way of working, a way of destabilizing other countries, a way of doing regime changes, and ultimately a way of going after communist or ex-communist countries. In the case of Russia, Russia is no longer a communist country. I've been there about 3 times. It's a capitalist country. So why would the United States want to take down this other capitalist country, except that it has these resources and access to these resources? It's something that the Western countries for years have wanted, for hundreds of years. I once heard that Sweden invaded Russia like 40 some times over the years. Napoleon invaded Russia. Hitler, of course, we know, invaded Russia. Russia lost 27 million people in World War II fighting against the Nazi invasion of the then Soviet Union. And so it's clear to me that the US current program of destabilization, demonization, because in order to expend the resources for the US and NATO to get the public to support all this stuff, possible war with Russia, they could go nuclear very quickly. You really got to demonize Putin and Russia. And so the Western media have been on this case for forever, as long as I can remember, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Just a few years later, they picked up on this demonization of Putin and Russia. So I think it's largely about this need, or this desire, rather, of the oil corporations. They want to drill, baby, drill in the Arctic. They want to control it. We know they're control freaks, these neocons that run foreign policy now. It doesn't matter which party is in power, Republican or Democrat. These neocons are out to get Russia, and they're out to break it to pieces so that Western oil corporations can have access to it.
Well, there's also the military industrial complex and how much money they make. I mean, I was listening to Democracy Now! Today, and they did a whole hour on the Ukraine situation, and they were talking with Medea Benjamin and then these two peace activists in Germany and Belgium. And, they brought up the fact that the United States, they're talking about the 185,000 troops that Russia has amassed along the Ukrainian border, but they don't talk about the 320,000 troops that the US has had in Europe ever since, the end of World War II. And they talk about the money that Russia is spending, and apparently their money for defense is 65 billion, whereas the US is 1.2 trillion. So it's 1/14 of what we're spending. They also mentioned the fact that they want to control Ukraine because it's between Europe and Asia, the Eurasian Sea. And of course, now, ever since Obama, we've had this pivot to China. And we're also demonizing China right now because we have to keep up the hegemony that we've always maintained. And we can't stand a multipolar society. We must have a unipolar society. So I think there's a lot of forces at play here. But, I wanted to go over a little bit this RAND report because I'm reading it here. It's called, as you said, Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. And they say some of the options examined are more promising than others, but any would need to be evaluated in the overall U.S. strategy for dealing with Russia. And they say they talk about economic cost imposing measures like expanding U.S. energy production, and that's one of the reasons why Germany, I think, does not want to, aside from the fact that they have a new government where they're sharing power between the Greens and the Liberals, they don't want to sell arms to Ukraine because they are getting oil right now from Russia. That was one of the reasons why we wanted to do that pipeline through Syria, Qatar, to have a pipeline through Syria to Europe to bypass the Russian pipeline through Turkey. And Assad didn't want that. And that's another reason why we had to go against Syria. I mean, all these things are connected and people don't get it. Like increasing Europe's ability to import gas from suppliers other than Russia. That's what we saw happen. Encouraging emigration from Russia of skilled labor and well-educated youth. Providing lethal aid to Ukraine. We provided $5 billion of aid to have a coup in 2014 because, as I discussed in my show with Kevin Zeese 3 years ago, the democratically elected president of Ukraine did not want to align with the European Union. So we put in our guy, this guy Yats, and we put in, the president, the prime minister, and the finance minister, who was an American citizen, who was running this hedge fund where they were funneling this $5 billion. I mean, it's so convoluted, but nobody in our country knows about this unless they really delve into it. So what do you want to talk more? I mean, there's just I'm going to put the link to this RAND report in there. Creating the perception that the regime is not pursuing the public interest, diminishing faith in the Russian electoral system, encouraging domestic protests and other nonviolent resistance, undermining Russia's image abroad. I mean, this is like a blueprint right here. It's so nefarious that if people knew what what do you think? I'm just getting outraged right now. Sorry, I shouldn't do that.
Well, I said earlier that when I was a kid, I wanted to join the FBI and fight organized crime. As an adult, I realized some years ago that even though I decided I didn't want to be associated with, law enforcement, I saw in the 60s, cops beating up Black people and anti-war protesters on the street. I thought I could never be associated with that, but I still want to fight organized crime. And so today, this very RAND study is the epitome of organized crime. I would call it terrorism, because what they're really calling for is bleeding the Russian government, create chaos on their borders, whether it's in Chechnya. That whole Chechnya operation years ago was a CIA op, all right? Or whether it's Georgia in 2008, when they attacked Russian enclaves in the northern part of Georgia, and Russia had to intervene to go in to save lives, or whether it's Ukraine in today's world, especially since 2013 and 2014, when the coup happened, orchestrated, as you say, by the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Victoria Nuland, all within the Biden administration. So the goal is to create chaos on the Russian border, force Russia to mobilize military, because we hear about all the Russian troops near the Ukrainian border, inside Russia, by the way. Since when is it illegal to have military exercises inside of your own country? U.S. does it all the time, and the U.S. does it all over the world. It has 800 bases around the world. It's doing military exercises all the time in various places. But anyway, on the other side of the border, inside of Ukraine, on the eastern border of Ukraine, what they call the Donbass region, the cities of Lugansk and Donetsk, which are Ukrainian citizens, but they're Russian ethnics. They speak Russian, and just on that, along that area there, the Ukrainian government, Kiev, has about 150,000 troops lined up along there, many of which are Nazis who have been trained by the United States at a base in Western Ukraine, train them, outfit them in nice, clean uniforms, and then send them to the Eastern Ukraine, where they shell daily since 2014. They shoot, they shell housing, apartment blocks, neighborhoods, churches, schools, daycare centers, airports, bus stations, train stations, water supply, sewer treatment plants. Everything you can imagine has been shelled, and over 10,000 people have been killed. Because why? Because the United States and NATO want to create chaos on Russia's border to destabilize it as part of this overall plan to break it apart. And clearly, as you said, you're absolutely right. The military-industrial complex makes big money off all this. I want to address one more thing. We often hear, whether it's on NPR or whether it's on MSNBC or reading the Washington Post or the New York Times, that Putin wants to recreate the former Soviet Union. He wants to take over Europe. Well, you said it yourself. Russia spends $65 billion on the military. It's the same, pretty much the same amount that Germany or France spends. You tell me how Russia is going to go up against the United States at $1.2 trillion a year in military spending. And then when you add in all the NATO countries to the US total, it's more than 60% of the global total of military spending. How is Russia going to do that on $65 billion? It ain't going to happen. And they know it. And that's why they keep trotting this line out there day after day, trying to scare people. And most people in America know nothing about it.
Well, it was really interesting when I watched Oliver Stone's The Untold History of the United States, and I learned about Henry Wallace for the first time and how he was a non-interventionist. He was Roosevelt's, last vice president. And in those days, they elected the vice president separately. And in that convention, Roosevelt's fourth election, Henry Wallace was winning. And we talk about shenanigans at the Democratic Convention. I was a delegate for Bernie in 2016. Well, Wallace was winning, so somebody pulled a fire alarm so that they would evacuate the hall, and they were able to twist more arms overnight, and the next day they had the vote and Truman won. And that really changed the course of history, because Truman was kind of a rube and a dupe of Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles, who were head of the CIA and the Secretary of State, respectively. And they came up with this whole Cold War BS about the domino theory, that Russia wanted to, control move westward. And what happened was we broke every agreement that Roosevelt made with Stalin at Yalta. We were supposed to rebuild Russia in the same way that we had a Marshall Plan for Europe.
Because so devastated in World War II. Again, they lost 27 million people. You know how many people, American GIs, died in that war? 500,000. Now, that's a lot of people. I'm not saying it's not, but it doesn't compare to 27 million. And so the idea that the Soviet Union after World War II was going to be aggressive and take over the world, they were rebuilding. They were smashed. They were, they had no capability.
Yeah, and really, I learned in college. I read a book by Gar Alperovitz, who I came to later meet. Ironically enough, years later, like 40 years later, I met him at the public banking conference in 2013. And I'm like, your name is familiar. And then I realized, because I look back at my paper that I wrote on the revisionist theory of the Cold War. I'm sorry, I actually wrote this in high school, probably in 1973. The revisionist theory of the Cold War, which was the sphere of influence, that Russia just wanted to have a sphere of influence on its western borders because it had this history of being attacked on its western borders. And all these other communist revolutions where we demonized them, like Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh wanted to meet with FDR and he wouldn't meet with him. All he was trying to do was overthrow the yoke of French imperialism. The same thing with Kim from North Korea, the grandfather. He was trying to overthrow the yoke of Japanese imperialism. And communism just meant you would have sort of self-governing units, these communes. It wasn't such a horrible thing when you think about what it really meant. It was more democratic than our government, which is supposed to be for the people, of the people, and by the people, because our government is really for the corporations, of the corporations, whatever those big corporations are. I mean, last night, the health insurance industry just killed California's single payer bill for the fourth time. And this is during a pandemic when the Democratic Party supposedly supports, single payer. It's in its platform. So anyway, I digress a little bit there, but the situation with Russia and, and you talk to the average person, as I do often, people who aren't political, and they'll say, the first thing they'll say is, well, Russia's an independent country and, they deserve to determine their own fate. But then you have to tell them, well, they didn't get to determine their own fate in 2014 when they wanted to remain independent. No, we couldn't have that. So we had to put in our people. And, the same thing with Crimea. They talk about how Russia invaded and stole Crimea. Well, Russia was already in Crimea, and it was actually the Crimeans that wanted to stay with Russia because most of them, were Russia. And Ukraine was always part of Russia. I mean, it was only, what did I hear today? I think it was just Khrushchev that gave Ukraine its independence.
That's right.
And, and then they talk about how we broke our promise.
Didn't give them their independence, but well, I guess you could say that. But Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. They were all one country, and so. But because he was Ukrainian, Khrushchev said, "Oh, let me give you this special gift of Crimea. You can say it's part of Ukraine." And nobody thought anything about it because they were all one country. That'd be like today, I don't know, the Biden deciding that he's going to say that, Miami could be, I don't know, forget I even said that. It doesn't make any sense. It's all crazy.
Just let me break in here. Ajamu Makalani is watching. He wanted to know if there was going to be a Q&A period. We don't really have ability to bring in our audience, but if you wanted to post a question here, I can put it up on the screen put it in a question form, though. I can put it on the screen for Bruce. But yeah, so what happened with the Crimea? There wasn't any invasion. They were already in there, and they just made a vote that they wanted to be with Russia. And the same thing with Eastern Ukraine. So What were you saying, I think, in your speech on the street in Bath about that the Nazis, the neo-Nazis there, was it you who said this, or did I read this somewhere else? That they were trying to pass a law that they couldn't even speak Russian?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me first say this. We're told that Putin invaded Crimea. The truth was that since Catherine the Great's time, around the time of the creation of the United States, our own revolution in the 1700s, there was a Navy base for the Russian Empire in Crimea, and there'd been one there ever since. And Putin had a long-term contract with Ukraine that Russia could utilize Crimea as a Navy base, and they could have up to 20,000 troops there. So at the time of the US orchestrated coup in Ukraine, there were 20,000 troops in Crimea. And what they did, not a shot was fired, nobody was killed. The citizens, as you said, organized, self-organized, had a referendum. And the only thing the soldiers did was stand on street corners, Russian soldiers, because the Nazis who had just pushed through this coup in Kiev at Maidan were now going to come to Ukraine because NATO wanted to grab it. They thought we can get NATO in there now that we've taken control of, with this coup in Kiev, we can grab Crimea and turn it into a NATO base, and man, we'll be sitting pretty, right on Russia's border. And so the Nazis were going to be sent into Crimea next. And so the people did the referendum, and the Russian soldiers just stood on street corners. I've been there. I've seen they have these statues of these soldiers just standing around there. And they were very grateful for it because they protected them from these marauding Nazis.
Right. Now they're still being funded, right? They're still being funded to attack them in the Donbass region. Tell us what that's like on a day-to-day basis. That's why the Russians are amassing on the border in their own country, as you pointed out.
Yeah. After the coup in 2014, the first thing the new right-wing government did was to outlaw the speaking of Russian in Ukraine. Half the country speaks Russian, but particularly on the eastern side of Ukraine, and again, the Donbass, right along the border of Russia, Lugansk, Donetsk, those cities. And so throughout the region, though, throughout the eastern part of Ukraine, in many, many different communities, people would hold peaceful marches and signature gathering campaigns. They wanted to call for a national referendum. Should we be allowed to speak Russian in Ukraine? Let's, have a referendum on it. And so these are very peaceful activities. So the US and NATO had Ukraine, had the government of Ukraine, this new government, send in the Nazis and to attack these people. And when they came to the Donbass, this is a coal mining part of Ukraine. The coal miners came out. They came out of the mines. They grabbed whatever they could get their hands on to literally defend their families against these Nazis who were attacking these rallies, these peaceful rallies. That's what started the conflict. And at the same time, a base was developed in Western Ukraine where U.S. Special forces from Fort Carson, Colorado, were sent in on a rotational basis. I know this because one of my friend's sons was a Special Forces troop from Fort Carson, and he was sent there twice to train these Nazis. And after they were trained, they would then send them to the eastern part of the country. Now, during World War II, when Hitler swept into the Soviet Union, when he came to Western Ukraine, which borders Poland, by the way, there was a leader there, a nationalist leader by the name of Stefan Bandera. And he put on a Nazi uniform and he gathered his supporters and they joined Hitler and they killed tens of thousands of Jews, Poles, and Russian ethnic people. And today, one of the first things, well, after the coup, one of the first things that the government did after declaring Russia illegal, the language illegal, they declared Stefan Bandera a national hero, right? Worshiping this Nazi killer, okay? And so this is what we're facing today. But the American media doesn't tell us anything about that whatsoever, do they? They don't tell us about the 150,000 troops from the Ukrainian government right on the contact line. It looks like World War I, trench warfare in the Donbass. They don't tell us that these people are largely Nazis and that they've been killing their fellow citizens whose only crime is that they speak Russian since 2014.
And they don't tell us that we put in those Nazis back in 2014. Now, Zelensky isn't a Nazi. Apparently, he's a lot better, but they're worried about him now because he's speaking out and he's telling Biden to, keep it down a little bit. And Benjamin Norton, who I had on my show twice, first to talk about Venezuela and then talk about Nicaragua, to dispel all the propaganda that were fed about those two countries. He did a Twitter thread the other day where he's projecting that Zelensky is not long for his role as president because he's speaking out against the United States. What do you think about that? Do you think the U.S. could pull off another coup?
I wouldn't put it past him. When Zelensky ran, he ran as, he was a comedian. He had no political experience whatsoever. He was selected by one of the leading, most corrupt oligarchs in Ukraine, and who happened to have a TV station. And he used the TV station to build support for Zelensky. But Zelensky ran on an anti-war campaign. The reason why is because the Russian ethnics are the predominant population inside of Ukraine. And he knew that to win the election, he had to speak in a peaceful way about relations with Russia and relations with the Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens. So after, though, he became president, the Nazis basically threatened his life and said, you either do what we say or we're going to kill you. And since that time, he's been shutting down any media inside of Ukraine that dared to try to be fair and be any somewhat critical of this Nazi approach that the country was partaking in. So he's really been a huge disappointment to the vast majority of Ukrainian citizens, and his popularity has dropped to nothing. And right now there's protests going on. Small business people just had a huge protest in Kiev just a few days ago where they're protesting against taxes and everything else. You said earlier that after the coup, the IMF loans came in, but they demanded that basically that Ukraine sell off all their assets. That includes, by the way, their topsoil that was sold to Monsanto, because Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe during the days of the Soviet Union. And now that topsoil, rich topsoil, has been sold to Monsanto, and they're starting to plant GMO crops in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Another reason that Russia is upset, because Russia is very anti-GMO, and they don't want those seeds flying over the border in the air, and contaminating their own crops.
Yeah, Kevin Zeese talked about that on my show with him 3 years ago, how, they didn't have private agricultural interests from outside the country, but that's something that happened after the coup. And yes, Monsanto came in with their GMO crops and polluted their pristine agriculture that they were so proud of. And also, as I mentioned earlier in the show, it was either the per capita income or the gross domestic, I guess it was the per capita income, went down 25%, which is what happens when we bring neoliberalism into a country. That happened all over South America, because we come in with the IMF and the World Bank, and we have these loans and we put them into debt, and they have to do these big infrastructure projects that we send in our big companies like Halliburton, Fluor, Bechtel to build, don't even hire the local workers. I mean, a lot of people think the Iraq war was about the oil. I disagree. I think the U.S. Oil companies had what they call production agreements with the Iraqi oil makers, and those production agreements were upset when they had the war. But what it really was an opportunity for the rebuilding contracts to go to Dick Cheney's Halliburton and all those other, companies that I mentioned. So this is like, the combination of the lethal combination of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Now, Ajamu has this question here. I'm going to put it on the screen. You should be able to see it.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to address that.
Yeah, I think Ajamu, I think you're absolutely right. Halford Mackinder wrote an essay theorizing the world island, basically talking about that essentially Russia was the middle of the world in a way. You got Asia on one side, and you got Europe on the other side, and in Russia, Ukraine, the other parts of the former Soviet Union around the Caspian Sea. This whole area is like the gateway from one world to the other, between East and West. And so I have a friend, Francis Boyle, who's a law professor in Illinois. He talks about this very teaching that has been, that he went to both Harvard and University of Chicago, that are two of the key foreign policy schools, where a lot of the bureaucrats and government technicians go to school and then get brought into various departments of the government. So he said this was really the teaching of the in Chicago and at Harvard. So I think you're absolutely right about this, and that it does today influence U.S. foreign policy. That the U.S. sees that it's on Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book, The Grand Chessboard, also talked about this, where he said that the U.S. needed to control this part of the world, this Central Asia, in order to control the global economy. So absolutely. And Brzezinski, we know, recruited Obama at Columbia University. Brzezinski's son was ambassador to Ukraine. Ambassador to Sweden during the Obama administration. I have friends in Sweden that told me he was terrible. He was always demonizing Russia, trying to get them to join NATO. So, that whole group of people inside of the government, and really, I think we use the word neocons to describe them. They're toxic.
Yeah.
They're terrorists. And I would say they're evil.
Yeah, and Victoria Nuland was married to one of them, Robert Kagan. He was one of the big neocons, although I have to say he wrote an essay in the Washington Post recently that I totally agree with, about how the right-wing Republican Party, today's extremist Republican Party, is taking over the democratic institutions. I mean, we know we don't have a democracy. We have an oligarchy in this country. But as far as taking over the Secretary of State's offices, the local electoral officials' offices, turning them into partisan thing, even taking over electors so that they can, overturn basically the election if it doesn't go their way. And the Democrats and Biden were very slow to respond to this. And they didn't get, the democracy, the Voting Rights Act passed. I mean, it's just a terrible mess. Now, I want to just pivot in the few minutes that we have left to talk about, solutions. We don't see any elected officials speaking out about this. I mean, so far, the only people that have issued a statement were Pramila Jayapal and Barbara Lee from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, but they didn't even do it on behalf of the caucus. It was just by themselves. And I'm just wondering where everybody else is silent on this. I mean, I haven't heard Bernie come out with a statement. Have you? I mean, he was the only one to call what happened in Bolivia a coup. I remember that from 2019.
Well, actually, Norman Solomon has an article out today. It was a really good one. I put it on my Facebook page if anybody wants to check it out. He really chastises the Democratic Party He says that uh, uh, he and others contacted what's her name? The senator from Massachusetts, the woman
Elizabeth Warren.
Elizabeth Warren. He contacted her office and Sanders' office, asking for a statement about the Biden arrogant and aggressive policy towards Russia and Ukraine, and they didn't want to give statements. He asked the squad for comments, and they refused. Basically, when they're not speaking out in the Senate and the House, there's not much there. I believe they they've been browbeat. They've been essentially bought off, and they won't even fight for Medicare for all inside of the House of Representatives or the Senate. So why are they going to take on the military-industrial complex? No, I think they're afraid to. Mussolini, Hitler, the Italian leader, fascist leader during World War II, defined fascism as the wedding of corporations and government.
Yeah.
Some years ago, back in the 80s, I read a book by Bertram Gross called Friendly Fascism, where he talked about three-piece suit fascism. And that's what I think we have in this country. We know we have a wedding of corporations and government today. I think both parties play good cop, bad cop. Their goal is their job, working for Wall Street, for the military-industrial complex, for the oil corporations. Their job for pharmaceuticals. Their job is to pit the American people against each other. And so the two parties, I believe, play good cop, bad cop. They take turns. One time the Democrats are the anti-war party, and now they're the pro-war party. They switch uniforms all the time. But in the end, they're still working for the man. I call him Mr. Big. They're working for Mr. Big, and there's no doubt in my mind about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was a delegate for Bernie at the 2016 convention in Philadelphia, and we were protesting. The California delegation was protesting. I led a protest against the TPP, and other people were leading protests, and we were shouting, "No more war, no more war." And the Hillary delegates got a hold of our chants, and they were told to shout over us. When we shouted "No more war," they were shouting "USA, USA," trying to drown us out, which was basically the chant that, they would chant at Trump rallies.
Right.
And, they turned the lights off on the Washington delegation when they were doing their anti-war protest. Yeah. And then the next day we all came in with these glow-in-the-dark, green shirts, sort of yellow-green shirts. So even when they turned off the lights and they could see us. But yeah, I mean, it's really, really discouraging. So what is the answer? I mean, I don't see a lot of people. Like here in Asheville, we talked about our mutual friend, Ken Jones. When this came out the other day, he got a bunch of people together. And I said, well, are there going to be speeches? If there's going to be speeches, I'll go live stream it. I said, let me know. And, he never contacted me. And afterwards he said, oh, good thing you didn't come down. There was nobody in downtown Asheville. We didn't have much of an audience. And I've covered so many of these things when I was living in LA, whether it was Syria, whether it was, whatever the country, we'd be out there protesting, and it just never seemed to make a difference. You organized this very large protest back in 1987. And of course you remember, although you were maybe on the other side back then of the Vietnam War, we had so many protests about that, but that's because we had a draft and people were being sent to, fight and die. Now it's totally voluntary. And we know that only poor people go to serve, and they do it as a way to get out of their small town where there's no jobs anymore because, Clinton with NAFTA and Obama with the TPP, were responsible for the outsourcing of high-paying factory jobs. So do you think that, how are we going to stop this if we don't have any politicians? You got Nancy Pelosi trying to rush through this $500 million bill, like we need to give them any more money, more of our treasure that could be going into needs for the American people. What do you think is the answer to this?
Well, I joined the Air Force in 1971 during the Vietnam War. At that time, I was a conservative, but it was there that I became a peace activist. I changed from experience by experience. I think most people learn from experience. So I'm all about trying to create experiences for people. I took a delegation of 20 some people to Russia. We went to Moscow, Crimea, St. Petersburg. People's lives were changed from that experience. Going to a big protest with 5,000 people, marching on Cape Canaveral with a helicopter descending right down over our heads. We couldn't communicate with each other. Anyway, but it created an experience for people that changed their lives. So as an organizer, I'm always looking for ways to create experiences for people that they see the contradictions that surround us, all the lies and everything else. One way is we got to get people to stop spending so much time reading corporate Western media and try to read media from other countries. Read some Russian media, read some media from China, read some media from El Salvador, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and that creates a new experience for people. So I think the more that we do, the better. But I also am a big believer in the great philosopher Yogi Berra, the former New York Yankees baseball player. And he had a saying that went like this: you can take them to the ball game, but you can't make them go in. And
Yeah.
he was so right. And so I realized that's my organizing philosophy today. I put it out there. You can take it or you can't. But in the end, I have to keep paddling always, because we're trying to make sure that my son, who's 40 years old now, that he has a future on this planet. And everyone else that has children and grandchildren, we're trying to make sure there's a future on our Mother Earth. And the only way we can do that is by staying consistent, determined, persistent, and having a real strong case of stick-to-itiveness in this time that we're living in.
Well, on that note, I'll just end with saying that Code Pink is calling for people to do protests in their cities on Saturday at a federal building about this. You are going to be on a webinar on Sunday, correct? Can you talk about who you're going to be appearing with?
Yeah, we're going to have actually two of my friends from they're refugees from Ukraine in 2014 after the coup. One hell of a lot of people in Ukraine had to escape because the Nazis were out to kill them. And so two of those people, they're leaders of an organization called the Union of Ukrainian Refugees in Russia. And they're going to be on that call. I've spent a lot of time with both of them. And there'll be some other people as well, but it should be really an interesting Zoom. And also on Saturday, I will be protesting here in Maine with my friends. We're inviting others to come in the mid coast of Maine. So we're going to keep being visible and bringing this message to people. I think there are more people out there than we realize that agree with us, but they're afraid to step out. They're afraid to stick their neck out. If they see others doing it, then they might have more courage to say something.
Yeah. Well, I just want to let people know that my next show is going to be on Thursday. I'll be interviewing 3 organizers from an organization called Southern Workers Assemblies. And this is something that is being started here in North Carolina to combat the fact that it's a right to work state and unions have no power here. So we're going to learn a little bit about what these Southern Workers Assemblies do. I really feel like I've totally given up on electoral politics. Basically, when Pramila Jayapal went against her commitment to hold the line and not vote for the infrastructure bill unless the Build Back Better bill got passed. When she broke that commitment, I said, that's it. I'm not voting for another federal official ever again. I'm just going to work on local issues and organizing. And I think union organizing, like I just read that the 55th Starbucks store today just went union. And I think this is really where it's a hopeful, because like you're talking about solidarity, when people are individualized, staying at home, looking at their own devices and not really feeling solidarity with people in similar conditions, it's very hard to do anything. But when you can get together like that and buck each other up, and like, it's really interesting. You have all these higher educated baristas basically that are underemployed because they can't get a job in this economy with their degrees, but a lot of them were Bernie Sanders organizers, and they're the ones that are sort of leading the charge to unionize these Starbucks. So I think it's very hopeful, and I've got a commitment for some of them to come on my show as well. So if this is the first time you've watched me, I've been doing this show for 5 years. I interview organizers, activists, independent journalists, authors, progressive elected officials, progressive candidates. And the whole focus is about making change and what people can do. It's not commentary on other YouTubers, which is sadly what a lot of left YouTube has evolved into, but really to provide a lot of information to you, information that you're not going to get in the corporate mainstream media. And that's why I was so pleased to have Bruce on my show. And so, Bruce, tell people where they can follow you on Twitter.
Oh, I don't do Twitter. We have someone that does it for us, but I don't do Twitter. But you can check us out at space4peace.org, space the number 4peace.org. And I have a blog called Organizing Notes, NOTES. And it's kind of like my daily organizing diary where I talk about what I'm doing and issues that I really care about. So if you just search for Organizing Notes, Bruce Gagnon, you ought to find it. Thank you, Lauren, for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. And you can follow me on Twitter at Lauren_Steiner. And you subscribe to my YouTube channel, Lauren from LA. Thanks, Bruce. And keep fighting, everyone.
Bye-bye.